In the center of West Africa over 800 years ago, someone spoke a prediction that would change an entire empire forever. A child who could not walk, made fun of by his own people, left behind by luck itself, would one day become the greatest king his land had ever known. His enemies said he was weak. His own brothers wanted him dead, but fate had different plans. This is the story of Sundiata, the prince who was forced to leave but could not walk yet learned to run. The forgotten son who would bring fighting kingdoms together. The Lion King of Mali. And his roar would be heard for hundreds of years. Before there was Ghana, before there was Songhai, before the great schools of Timbuktu brought teachers from 3 continents, there was Mali. But Mali was not always an empire. It was a group of broken kingdoms, always at war, easy to conquer, drowning in chaos. And into this world of uncertainty, in the year 1217, a child was born who would change everything. His name was Sundiata Keita, and though you may not have heard his name in your history classes, his story is one of the most amazing tales of victory ever told. A story kept alive not in books, but in the memories of griots, the storytellers of West Africa who have passed down his legend from generation to generation for over 800 years. This is not just a story about a king. It's a story about fate and fighting back, about a mother's never-ending love and a son's unbreakable will, about how the weakest among us can become the strongest, about how one man's journey from shame to glory would create an empire that would control West Africa for hundreds of years and become one of the richest civilizations the world has ever known. But to understand Sundiata's rise, we must first understand his fall. And that story begins not with victory, but with a prediction that seemed impossible. Our story begins in Niani, a small but important kingdom along the Niger River in what is now modern-day Guinea. This was the heartland of the Mandinka people, and it was ruled by King Nare Magan Konate, known as Magan the Handsome. He was a powerful but not very ambitious ruler who was happy to keep his small kingdom in peace. But one day everything changed. 2 hunters arrived at Magan's court. These were not ordinary men. They were mystics, travelers who said they could see the future, and they brought with them a message that would change history. They told King Magan about a prediction. He would have a son who would become the greatest king the land had ever known. A son who would unite all the kingdoms of the grasslands under one rule. A son whose name would be remembered forever. But there was one condition. The mother of this predicted child would not be one of Magan's current wives. She would be a woman who was very ugly, a woman so unpleasant to look at that accepting her would require believing in the prediction itself. King Magan was interested. A prediction of greatness. What ruler wouldn't want such a future for his family? But he was also unsure. How could these traveling hunters know the future? And who was this woman they spoke of? The answer came soon enough. The hunters brought before him a woman named Sogolon Konde. She was from the land of Do, and she was indeed everything the prediction had described. Hunchbacked, awkward in appearance, pushed away by society. The griots describe her as having a body that made people feel sorry for her rather than attracted to her. But they also say she had something else, a powerful spiritual energy. She was said to have the spirit of the buffalo of Do, a legendary creature that had terrorized her homeland until it was finally killed. Sogolon was somehow connected to that buffalo's power, taking on its strength. Despite his hesitation and despite the teasing of his court, King Magan chose to trust the prediction. He married Sogolon, making her one of his wives, though she would never be his favorite. His first wife, Sasuma Berete, was beautiful, proud, and had already given him a son named Dankaran Tuman. Sasuma was convinced her son would inherit the throne. She saw Sogolon as no threat, just another unfortunate woman trapped in the politics of royal marriage. But predictions have a way of coming true in their own time. Sogolon became pregnant, and in the year 1217, she gave birth to a son. They named him Sundiata, which means lion of the Sundiata clan, but also in some sayings hungering lion, a name that would prove meaningful in ways no one could have imagined. The court waited for signs of greatness. Surely the predicted child would show amazing qualities from birth. Surely he would be strong, likable, obviously meant for kingship. Instead, they got silent. Sundiata did not walk. Not at 1 year old, not at 2, not at 3. While other children his age were running through the courtyards exploring the world, Sundiata could only crawl. His legs would not support his weight. Some whispered that he was disabled. Others said he was cursed. The prediction began to look like a cruel joke. Sasuma, the first wife, was happy. She made fun of Sogolon without mercy. "Where is this great king you were promised?" She would tease. "I see only a disabled child who cannot even stand." Her own son, Dankaran Tumen, seemed the obvious heir now. He was strong, healthy, everything a prince should be. The prediction everyone agreed must have been false. But Sogolon never lost faith. Even as the years passed and her son remained unable to walk, even as the teasing grew louder, even as King Magan himself began to doubt, Sogolon believed. She would sit with her son, holding him, telling him stories of great warriors and kings. She reminded him of the prediction. She told him that fate was not about how you begin, but how you finish. And Sundiata listened. Unable to walk, unable to play with other children, he developed something else. An amazing mind. He absorbed everything. He listened to the griots singing the histories of past kings. He watched his father's court, learning the hidden politics of power. He understood even as a child that strength came in many forms. But understanding something and living it are two different things. And for young Sundiata, life was about to become much harder. Imagine being a child who cannot walk in a culture that celebrates warriors. Imagine being a prince who cannot stand while other boys learn to hunt, to fight, to prove their worth. Imagine being told you are meant for greatness, while everyone around you sees only weakness. This was Sundiata's childhood. By the time he was 7 years old, the teasing had become unbearable. Not just from Sasuma, though her cruelty was constant, but from the entire court. Children made fun of him. Servants felt sorry for him. Even his father, though he tried to hide it, seemed disappointed. King Magan had believed the prediction once, but years of seeing his son crawl rather than walk had worn down that faith. Sogolon bore the worst of the shame. As Sundiata's mother, she was blamed for his condition. Was she cursed? Had she done something to anger the spirits? The questions were whispered behind her back, but loud enough for her to hear. And through it all, she remained strong for her son. The breaking point came on an ordinary day that would become amazing. Sogolon needed baobab leaves to prepare a meal. In West African cooking, these leaves are a common ingredient, healthy and flavorful. Normally, she would send a servant, but Sasuma had forbidden the palace servants from helping Sogolon, a mean cruelty meant to remind her of her low status. So Sogolon had to ask neighbors, other women in the community, if she could have some leaves from what they gathered. When Sasuma heard about this, she saw an opportunity for maximum shame. She sent a message to Sogolon, offering her some baobab leaves, but with a cutting remark. "Here are leaves for the mother of the child who cannot walk. At least my son can stand on his own feet to pick whatever I need." The message was delivered publicly, loudly, making sure everyone heard the insult. Sogolon returned to her home, the leaves in her hands, tears streaming down her face. This wasn't just about leaves. This was about dignity. This was about watching her son suffer daily shame while she was powerless to change it. This was about a prediction that seemed more and more like a lie. Sundiata saw his mother crying, and something inside him changed. He was 7 years old, some traditions say 9, and he had never stood on his own. But in that moment, watching his mother's tears, feeling the weight of her sacrifice and suffering, Sundiata made a decision. He would stand, not tomorrow, not next year. Now, he called for the royal blacksmith, a man named Naun Fiery. "Make me an iron staff," Sundiata said, his voice carrying a power that shocked everyone who heard it. "Make it from the strongest iron you have." "I'm going to stand." The blacksmith hesitated. He had seen the boy's condition. He knew what everyone knew. Sundiata could not support his own weight, but there was something in the child's eyes that made him obey. He went to his forge and made a huge iron staff so heavy that 3 strong men could barely lift it. It was meant to be impossibly heavy, a test of whether this moment was real or just another false hope. When the staff was brought to Sundiata, the court gathered. Word had spread. Everyone wanted to see what would happen. Would the disabled prince finally admit defeat? Would this be the end of the pretending? Zogolon watched, her heart breaking with hope and fear. Sundiata grabbed the iron staff with both hands. The griots tell us that he prayed to the ancestors, calling on the spirits of all the great warriors who had come before him. And then, with every bit of strength in his small body, he pulled himself up. The staff bent under his weight. The iron, which should have been unbreakable, curved like a bow. But Sundiata did not fall. His legs, which had never held him, began to straighten. His knees, which had never locked, found their strength. And slowly, impossibly miraculously, Sundiata stood. The courtyard fell silent. And then Sundiata took a step, and another. The bent iron staff straightened as his legs grew stronger with each movement. He walked across the courtyard, and with each step he seemed to grow, not just in height but in presence. The disabled child was gone. In his place stood a young prince radiating power and purpose. He walked to a baobab tree, the very tree from which his mother's shame had come, and with strength that seemed impossible for a child who had never walked, he pulled up the entire tree. He carried it to his mother and laid it at her feet. "Here, mother," he said, "you will never need to beg for baobab leaves again." The court was stunned. Sasuma was terrified because at that moment everyone remembered the prediction. It had spoken of a great king, and they had just witnessed the impossible. But fate is never simple, and Sundiata's troubles were only beginning. Sundiata's amazing recovery should have been a moment of victory, and it was for a brief, shining moment. The court celebrated. The griots sang of the miracle. King Magan, seeing his son walk for the first time, cried with joy and relief. The prediction was real after all. But not everyone was celebrating. Sasuma Berete, the first wife, watched the celebration with growing fear. Her son, Dankarantuman, had been the obvious heir. For 7 years, she had been confident in his future. The throne was his by right of being the oldest son of the king's first wife. The disabled half-brother had been no threat at all until now. Now, as she watched the court's reaction to Sundiata's change, as she saw the way people looked at him with new respect and wonder, she understood that everything had changed. The prediction that had seemed like a joke was coming true before her eyes. If Sundiata continued to grow in strength and reputation, her son's claim to the throne would be challenged, perhaps even taken away. Sasuma could not allow this. She began to plot. Her first plan was subtle, poisoning King Magan's mind against Sundiata. She would whisper doubts in his ear. "Yes, the boy can walk now, but is that really proof of a prediction? Perhaps it was just a late development. Dankaran is still the older one. Tradition should be honored." She reminded the king constantly that changing the succession would create conflict, possibly even civil war among the Mandinka people. And her words had an effect. King Magan, though proud of Sundiata, was also a practical ruler. He knew that overturning succession based on a prediction would be controversial. He began to waver, but Sasuma wasn't happy with just keeping her son's position. She wanted Sundiata gone completely, because as long as he lived, he would be a threat. And so she turned to darker methods. She looked for witches and sorcerers, people who dealt in curses and spiritual killing. She offered them gold, promises of position, anything they wanted if they could get rid of the predicted child. Several attempts were made. Poison was put in his food, but Sundiata did not eat it. Curses were placed on his path, but they seemed to slide off him like water off stone. It was as if he was protected by something beyond the physical world. Some griots say it was the spirit of the buffalo that his mother carried. Others say it was the will of the ancestors. But whatever the protection, Sundiata survived every attempt on his life. During this time, Sundiata was growing into an amazing young man. Having learned to walk, he seemed to be making up for lost time. He became strong, not just physically, but in character. He was generous where others were selfish, humble where others were proud. He made friends easily, and those friends became fiercely loyal to him. He hunted with skill, fought with courage, and showed a natural charm that drew people to him. He also had a gift for understanding people. Those years of watching from his crawling position had taught him to read character, to see beyond appearances. He knew who was genuine and who was fake. He understood power relationships naturally, and he never forgot those who had shown kindness to his mother during their darkest days. Among his closest companions were a few who would stay with him throughout his life. There was Bala Faseke, son of the royal griot, who became Sundiata's personal griot and trusted advisor. There was his half-sister Nana Triban, who remained loyal despite family pressures. And there were friends from across the social levels, hunters, warriors, even the children of slaves. Because Sundiata judged people by their character, not their birth. This quality made him loved among common people, but worried the nobility. A prince who befriended everyone, who treated slaves like equals, who questioned traditions. This was dangerous, not because he was cruel, but because he was revolutionary in his thinking. And then, when Sundiata was still a young teenager, King Magan fell sick. The illness came suddenly and got worse rapidly. Within weeks, it was clear the king was dying. And as he lay on his deathbed, he faced the most important decision of his rule. Who would succeed him? He called his advisors together. He called both his wives, and he made his choice. Despite the prediction, despite Sundiata's clear qualities, King Magan chose tradition. He named Dankaran Tuman as his heir. The reasons were complicated. Partly it was Sasuma's influence. Partly it was political planning. Dankaran was older, and his claim was less controversial. But perhaps most importantly, Magan feared what would happen to Sundiata if he named him heir. He knew Sasuma would never accept it. He knew there would be conflict, possibly murder. By naming Dankaran, he hoped to protect Sundiata by making him seem less threatening. It was a father's last attempt to protect his predicted son, but it would prove to be a deadly mistake. King Magan died shortly after, and Dankaran Tuman became king. He was young, inexperienced, and completely under his mother's control. And Sasuma, who had feared for her son's position for so long, now had the power to get rid of her fear forever. She convinced Dankaran that as long as Sundiata lived, his rule would never be secure. The prediction still existed. People still remembered the miracle of Sundiata's walking. There would always be those who believed the wrong son sat on the throne. There was only one solution. Sundiata must die, Dankaran, weak and controlled, agreed. But killing a popular prince, especially one protected by prediction, was not simple. It had to be done carefully, either through seeming accident or through exile that would lead to death. Plans were made, assassins were hired, and Zogolon, who understood court politics better than anyone gave her credit for, realized what was happening. She had to save her son, and there was only one way to do it. They had to leave, not just the palace, but Niani itself. They had to go into exile before Sasuma's plots could work. It was a terrible choice. Sundiata was the predicted king. This was his kingdom. By leaving, he would be abandoning his fate. But Zogolon understood something important. You cannot fulfill a prediction if you're dead. Sometimes survival requires retreat. The lion may withdraw from the hunt, but only to strike more powerfully later. And so, in the dark of night, Zogolon made preparations for the most painful journey of her life. She was taking her son into exile, away from his birthright, away from his fate. She was choosing life over prediction, hope over certainty. She was saving the Lion King by teaching him to run. The night they left Niani, Sundiata was still a teenager. He had lived his entire life in the palace, surrounded by servants, protected by his father's name. Now he was being forced to run like a criminal, to leave everything he knew because his own brother wanted him dead. Zogolon gathered her children, not just Sundiata, but his younger siblings as well. There was his sister, Zogolon Kolonkan, and his brother Manding Bori, both still children themselves. She packed what little they could carry without raising suspicion. Gold and valuable items had to be left behind. Taking them would signal their plans. They left with almost nothing, but they did not leave alone. Balafaseke, Sundiata's griot and friend, wanted to come with them, but Sogolon made him stay. And this is important. Balafaseke remained in Niani as Sundiata's representative, his eyes and ears in the court, keeping the connection to his homeland. This would prove important later. They also had a few loyal servants and 1 or 2 warriors who believed in the prediction and could not bear to see Sundiata murdered. These people risked everything to go with the exiled family into an uncertain future. Their first stop was the nearby kingdom of Jeba. They hoped to find safety with its king, perhaps even military support to return and claim the rightful throne. But word had spread. Sasuma, discovering their escape, had sent messages to neighboring kingdoms. The exiled prince was dangerous. His mother was a witch. Anyone who protected them would be considered an enemy of Niani. The king of Jeba, faced with this choice, chose self-preservation. He offered them shelter for a few days, gave them some supplies, and then politely asked them to leave. He would not risk war for a displaced prince with no army and no power. It was the first rejection, but it would not be the last. For the next several years, some traditions say 7 years, others say up to 13. Sundiata and his family wandered through West Africa looking for safety and finding only temporary shelter. They traveled to Tabon, to Ouagadougou, to various small kingdoms and tribal territories. Each time the pattern was the same. Initial welcome, often based on traditional hospitality, followed by growing worry as the hosts realized who they were protecting, followed by a request, sometimes gentle, sometimes not, that they move on. The exile years were brutal for the family, especially for Sogolon. She was not a young woman anymore, and the years of travel, of uncertainty, of watching her children go hungry wore on her. But she never complained. She never showed doubt. To the very end, she kept her faith in her son's fate. Sundiata, meanwhile, was learning lessons that no palace education could have taught him. He learned humility, what it meant to be powerless, to depend on the charity of others. He learned to read people's true intentions, to tell the difference between genuine hospitality and fear-driven tolerance. He learned patience, understanding that fate unfolds in its own time, not on our preferred schedule. He also learned about the bigger world. Each kingdom they visited had its own customs, its own political structures, its own strengths and weaknesses. Sundiata absorbed all of this. He was learning to think not just as a Mandinka prince, but as someone who understood the complex web of West African politics. And he made friends. Despite being an exile, despite having no power or wealth to offer, Sundiata's personality drew people to him. In each kingdom, he befriended warriors, hunters, princes, people who were impressed by his character rather than his status. These relationships, formed in obscurity, would become the foundation of his future army. But there was pain, too. Deep personal pain. The family's poverty was grinding. There were times when they went hungry, when they had to beg for food. For a prince who had grown up in a palace, for children who had known only comfort, this was a shocking education in hardship. Sundiata watched his mother's health decline. He watched his younger siblings suffer, and he could do nothing but endure and promise that one day things would be different. The psychological toll was perhaps even worse than the physical hardship. Sundiata had to live with the knowledge that his own brother wanted him dead, that his father had chosen tradition over fate, that he was in exile from the very kingdom he was predicted to rule. It would have broken a weaker person. It would have turned someone bitter, filled with rage and a desire for revenge. But Sundiata did not break. Instead, he focused on becoming worthy of his prediction. He trained constantly, sharpening his physical strength and combat skills. He studied leadership by watching the kings who hosted them, noting what made a ruler successful and what led to weakness. He treated everyone with respect, from the highest noble to the lowest servant, building a reputation as someone of exceptional character. One of their longer stops was in the kingdom of Mima, far to the north of Niani. The king of Mema Musa Tunkara was different from the others. He was older, wiser, and powerful enough that he didn't fear Sasuma's threats. He welcomed Sundiata and his family, and more than that, he recognized something special in the exiled prince. In Myanmar, Sundiata found something he hadn't had in years: stability. He was given a position in the king's army, a chance to prove himself not as a prince, but as a warrior and leader. And prove himself he did. Sundiata stood out in battle, in hunts, in every test of skill and courage. He became one of King Tunkara's most valued warriors. The king, who had no sons, began to see Sundiata as a potential heir. He offered him everything: a permanent home, wealth, power, even the possibility of inheriting the kingdom of Myanmar. For someone who had spent years wandering and suffering, this was an amazing opportunity. But it wasn't his fate, and Sundiata knew it. During these years in exile, Sogolon never let him forget the prediction. Even as they suffered, even when it seemed impossible that he would ever return to Niani, she reminded him, "You are not just any prince. You are the predicted one. Mali waits for you, even if it doesn't know it yet." And then, after years of wandering, after years of seeming obscurity, news arrived that would change everything. News from Niani, news of a new and terrible threat that made all the old rivalries suddenly meaningless. A sorcerer king named Sumaoro Kante had risen in the land of Soso, and he was conquering everything in his path. To understand what happened next, we need to step back and look at what had been happening in West Africa while Sundiata was in exile. The region was broken up into dozens of small kingdoms and chiefdoms, constantly competing for resources and power. This had been the way things were for generations. A collection of minor states, none powerful enough to control the others, existing in an uneasy balance of rivalries and alliances. But nature hates an empty space, and into this broken political landscape came a man who would change everything. Sumaoro Kante, king of Soso. Sumaoro was not like other kings. He was a blacksmith by training, which in West African society carried particular importance. Blacksmiths were seen as having special powers. They worked with fire and iron, changing raw materials into weapons and tools. They existed in a special space between the physical and spiritual worlds. But Sumaoro was more than just a blacksmith. He was a sorcerer, a practitioner of dark magic who had spent decades building up spiritual power. The griots describe him as terrifying in appearance and manner. Tall, with eyes that seemed to pierce through people, a voice that could make warriors tremble. He wore decorations made from the bones of enemies he had killed. His palace was said to be filled with the instruments of his magic: drums made from human skin, fetishes that gave him power over life and death. Whether these descriptions are literally true or symbolic, the point is clear. Sumaoro was someone who caused absolute terror, and he used that terror as a weapon as much as his armies. Starting from Soso, a kingdom in what is now Guinea, Sumaoro began a campaign of conquest unlike anything the region had seen. He attacked neighboring kingdoms one by one, using a combination of military force and psychological warfare. Those who resisted were crushed brutally. Those who gave up were absorbed into his growing empire, but treated as subjects, not equals. Within a few years, Sumaoro had conquered vast territories, and then he turned his attention to Niani, the heartland of the Mandinka people, Sundiata's homeland. Dankaran Tuman, who had never been a strong or wise king, was completely unprepared for this threat. When Sumaoro's armies appeared on his borders, Dankaran panicked. He tried to negotiate, offering tribute and submission. But Sumaoro wanted more than submission. He wanted total control. The griots tell us that Sumaoro made impossible demands. He required not just gold and supplies, but humiliating acts of servitude. He demanded that Dankaran send him Bala Faseke, Sundiata's griot, basically as a hostage. Dankaran, desperate to avoid war, agreed to everything. But giving in only encouraged Sumaoro. Seeing Dankaran's weakness, he decided to take Niani by force anyway. His armies invaded, and what followed was brutal. The Mandinka warriors, discouraged by their king's cowardice and facing Sumauro's seemingly invincible forces, were defeated quickly. Dankaran Tuman ran away. The king who had taken his brother's throne, who had driven Sundiata into exile, who had ruled Niani for years, ran away in the face of invasion. He abandoned his people, his kingdom, everything. Some accounts say he died in exile, broken and forgotten. Others say he lived out his days in obscurity and shame. Either way, his reign ended not with dignity, but with desertion. Nisani fell under Sumauro's control, and what followed was a dark period for the Mandinka people. Sumaoro ruled not as a king, but as a tyrant. He imposed crushing taxes. He took young men to serve in his armies. He showed no respect for local customs or traditions. The land of the Mandinka, once proud and independent, was now just another province in Sumauro's empire. But worse than the political control was the spiritual oppression. Sumauro's sorcery seemed to make him invincible. Warriors who had fought bravely for years suddenly found themselves unable to resist. Arrows that should have hit him missed. Spears that should have pierced him bounced off. It was as if he was protected by forces beyond human understanding. The Mandinka people began to lose hope. They had been conquered before, but always there had been the possibility of rebellion, of eventual freedom. But how do you fight a sorcerer king who cannot be killed by normal means? How do you resist someone who commands dark powers? And then, in their darkest hour, they remembered the prediction. They remembered the prince who had been exiled years ago, the one who was supposed to become the greatest king they had ever known. The one who had walked after being disabled, who had pulled up a baobab tree with his bare hands, who had shown that the impossible could become possible. They remembered Sundiata. Messengers were sent out, traveling to every kingdom where Sundiata might have found safety. They carried a message from what remained of the free Mandinka people. "Come back! We need you. The prediction must be fulfilled, or we will remain slaves forever." One of these messengers eventually reached Mema, where Sundiata had been living in relative comfort and honor. The messenger found him training with King Tunkara's warriors and delivered the news. Niani had fallen. Sumaoro Kante had conquered the Mandinka homeland. The people were suffering under tyranny, and they were calling for Sundiata to return. Sundiata listened to the news in silence. Years of exile, years of wandering and suffering, and now this. A chance to return. But not as a conqueror reclaiming his throne from a brother who took it, as a liberator, fighting against an enemy far more dangerous than Dankaran had ever been. King Tunkara watched his reaction carefully. He had come to love Sundiata like a son, and he knew that if the prince returned to Niani, he would probably never come back to Mema. He would lose the best warrior in his army, possibly his heir. But he also understood fate when he saw it. "This is what you were meant for," King Tunkara said. "Not to be my heir, but to be your own king. Go save your people. Fulfill your prediction." It was an act of amazing generosity. But more than that, it was necessary because Sumaoro Kante wasn't just a threat to the Mandinka people. If he continued unchecked, he would eventually threaten Mema and every other kingdom in the region. Someone had to stop him, and perhaps only the predicted king could do it. But Sundiata faced a problem. He had no army. He was one man, however strong and skilled. To fight Sumaoro, he would need warriors, weapons, supplies, and allies. He would need to build from nothing the force that could free his people. And his mother, who had guided him through years of exile, would not live to see it. Before Sundiata could begin his campaign to return to Niani, he faced a loss that would mark him for the rest of his life. Sogolon, his mother, the woman who had never lost faith in him, who had endured mockery, exile, and poverty for his sake, fell very sick. The years of wandering had taken their toll. She was no longer young. The constant stress, the poor food, the endless uncertainty, all of it had worn down her body. By the time the messenger arrived from Niani, Sogolon was already weakening. And when she heard the news, when she understood that her son would finally return to claim his fate, something in her relaxed, as if she had been holding on only to see this moment. Sundiata stayed by her side as she got worse. For days, he barely left her home. this woman who had been his anchor through everything. And as she lay dying, Sogolon gave her son her final instructions. The griots preserve her words, passed down through the centuries. She told him, "Remember who you are. Remember where you come from. Do not become cruel in your strength. Do not forget those who suffer because you have suffered. Do not become proud of victory because you know what defeat feels like. And most importantly, trust in the prediction. No matter how impossible the situation seems, no matter how powerful your enemies appear, remember that your fate was spoken before you were born. You are the Lion King of Mali." She also gave him practical advice. She told him which allies to trust and which to watch carefully. She reminded him of the debts they owed to people who had helped them during exile, debts of honor that must be repaid. She told him about the political landscape as she understood it, which kingdoms might be convinced to join his cause, which were too afraid of Sumaoro to help. And then, with her children around her, with the son she had fought so hard to protect holding her hand, Sogolon died. For Sundiata, it was devastating. His mother had been the one constant through all the ups and downs of his life. When he couldn't walk, she believed he would. When his father chose his brother over him, she knew it was temporary. When they were exiled and homeless, she never lost hope. She had been his strength when he had none of his own. Now she was gone, just as he was about to start the greatest challenge of his life. The griots say that Sundiata cried for 3 days, not just tears of sorrow, but of gratitude, because he understood what his mother had done for him. She had sacrificed everything, her comfort, her status, her health, her very life, to make sure that he would survive long enough to fulfill the prediction. She had been the shield that protected him when he was vulnerable, the voice that encouraged him when he doubted, the faith that held him up when faith seemed foolish. King Tunkara gave Sogolon a royal burial, honoring her as the mother of a predicted king. Warriors from across Mima attended. Even in exile, even in a kingdom not her own, she was recognized for what she truly was. A woman of amazing courage and unwavering love. After the burial, Sundiata changed. Those who knew him said there was a new intensity to him, a fierce determination that hadn't been there before. His mother's death had removed the last hesitation, the last doubt. He was no longer just a displaced prince hoping to return home. He was a man with a mission, carrying the weight of his mother's sacrifice, driven by something deeper than personal ambition. He was ready to become what the prediction had always said he would be. But first, he had to build an army. Sundiata began his campaign not with weapons, but with words and relationships. He understood something important. You cannot defeat a powerful enemy alone. You need allies, people who believe in your cause enough to risk everything. And Sundiata had been preparing for this moment his entire exile, though he might not have realized it. Remember all those friendships he had made during the wandering years? All those warriors and hunters and princes who had been impressed by his character? All those people who had helped his family when they had nothing to offer in return? Now was the time to call in those debts of honor and friendship. King Tunkara was his first and most important ally. The king not only released Sundiata from his service, but gave him an initial force of warriors. Not a huge army, but enough to begin with. He also provided weapons, supplies, and his blessing. This was important because it gave Sundiata legitimacy. He wasn't just a wandering exile anymore. He had the backing of a powerful king. But Tunkara's support came with wisdom. He told Sundiata, "I can give you warriors, but I cannot give you all the men you need. Sumaoro's forces are vast. You must gather allies from across the land, and you must do it quickly before Sumaoro learns what you're planning and moves to crush you before you're ready." Sundiata took this advice to heart. He began traveling again, but this time not as a refugee seeking shelter. This time as a leader gathering support for a cause. And his message was simple but powerful. Sumaoro Kante is not just a threat to the Mandinka people. He is a threat to everyone. Today he rules Niani. Tomorrow he could rule your kingdom. Unite now to stop him or fall one by one later. It was a compelling argument, but words alone don't convince kings to commit their warriors to someone else's war. Sundiata needed to offer something more, and he did. He promised that any kingdom that helped him defeat Sumaoro would be part of a new alliance, a confederation of equals, rather than conquered subjects. He wasn't asking them to serve him. He was inviting them to build something new together. This was revolutionary thinking. In that era, conquest usually meant control. The winner takes all. But Sundiata was proposing something different. Shared power, mutual benefit, collective security. It was an idea born from his years of exile, from seeing how broken kingdoms were vulnerable, from understanding that strength came from unity rather than domination. His first major recruitment success was in Tabon, a kingdom he had passed through during his exile years. The king of Tabon remembered Sundiata, remembered his character, his manner, the way he had treated people with respect, even when he had nothing. When Sundiata returned and explained his mission, the king committed warriors to the cause. Then came the kingdom of Sibi, then Ouagadougou, the remnant of the old Ghana Empire. Each success made the next easier because word spread. The exiled prince was gathering an army. The predicted king was returning, and importantly, he was winning people to his cause, not through threats or bribes, but through the force of his vision and character. But the most important recruitment wasn't of a kingdom. It was for individuals. Sundiata went to the regions where the best warriors lived, where the legendary hunters gathered, where men of exceptional skill and courage could be found. He looked for them personally, often in dramatic fashion. One famous story tells of how Sundiata traveled to meet a warrior known for never having been defeated in combat. This warrior was skeptical. Why should he join some exiled prince's hopeless cause? Sundiata challenged him to a contest. If Sundiata won, the warrior would join him. The warrior agreed, certain of victory. They wrestled, and Sundiata won. But then, in a gesture that won the warrior's complete loyalty, Sundiata declared that the match had been too close to call, and they should consider themselves equals. The warrior, moved by this humility and generosity, not only joined Sundiata, but brought dozens of other fighters with him. Another important alliance was with the hunter confederations. In West African society, hunters were more than just people who tracked animals. They were mystics, experts in spiritual matters, people who understood the unseen forces of nature. They were organized into societies with their own leaders and codes of honor. And they hated Sumaoro, who had disrupted the spiritual balance of the land with his dark sorcery. When Sundiata approached them, they saw something important. Here was someone who could potentially match Sumaoro's spiritual power. Because Sundiata wasn't just strong physically. He carried the protection of the prediction, the blessing of his mother's buffalo spirit. The hunters believed he had a chance against the sorcerer king, and they pledged their support. As weeks turned to months, Sundiata's force grew. It wasn't yet an army capable of facing Sumaoro's full might. But it was no longer just a handful of warriors. He had thousands of fighters now, drawn from across West Africa, united by a common cause and by faith in the predicted king. But gathering an army was only half the challenge. The other half was preparing them for what was coming, because fighting Sumaoro wasn't like fighting a normal enemy. His sorcery made him seemingly invincible. Arrows missed, spears bent. Warriors, who should have been victorious, found themselves mysteriously weakened in his presence. How do you fight someone like that? Sundiata needed to understand Sumaoro's power, to find its source and its weakness. Because every power, no matter how great, has a limit. Every invincibility has a vulnerability. He needed to find Sumaoro's, and that's where Balafaseke came in. The griot who had stayed behind in Niani all those years ago. While Sundiata had been in exile, Balafaseke had remained in Niani, serving whoever ruled it. First Dankaran Tuman, then Sumaoro Kante. This might seem like betrayal, but it wasn't. Griots had a special status in West African society. They were historians, advisors, and truth-tellers, but they were also required to serve whoever held power. A griot's loyalty was ultimately to the preservation of history and culture, which meant surviving political changes. But Balafaseke had never forgotten his true master. All those years, even while serving in Sumaoro's court, he had remained loyal to Sundiata in his heart. And he had been watching, learning, waiting for the moment when the information he gathered might be useful. When Sumaoro conquered Niani, he had taken Balafaseke into his service because a king needed a griot, and Balafaseke was one of the best. This meant that the griot had access to Sumaoro's court, to his private chambers, to conversations and observations that others could never witness. And what Balafaseke observed was both fascinating and terrifying. Sumaoro's palace in Soso was unlike any other. It was built like a fortress, but it was also a temple to his magical power. There was a special chamber, the sacred sanctuary, where Sumaoro kept the sources of his power. Only he was allowed to enter this room. The penalty for anyone else entering was death. But Balafaseke was a griot, which meant he was clever, patient, and observant. Over time, he learned the palace's rhythms, its secrets. He watched and waited, and eventually an opportunity came. One day, when Sumaoro was away from the palace dealing with a military matter, Balafaseke made a decision that could have cost him his life. He would enter the forbidden chamber. He would discover the source of Sumaoro's power because he had realized something important. If Sundiata was going to return and fight the sorcerer king, he would need to know what he was up against. The griots described what Balafaseke found in that chamber, and it was the stuff of nightmares. The room was filled with the instruments of Sumaoro's sorcery. There were drums made from human skin. There were skulls of his enemies arranged in patterns of magical importance. There were fetishes, objects filled with spiritual power, hanging from the walls and ceiling. The air itself felt heavy with dark energy. But most importantly, Balafaseke found Sumaoro's sacred balafon, a traditional wooden xylophone that was central to the sorcerer king's power. This wasn't just any musical instrument. It was magical, crafted with rituals, and filled with the spirits that served Sumaoro. When he played it, his power was made stronger. It was, in many ways, the physical form of his invincibility. Balafaseke, being a griot and therefore a master musician, couldn't resist. Despite the danger, despite knowing that touching anything in this chamber could mean his death, he picked up the mallets and began to play the balafon. The sound was unlike anything he had ever produced before. It wasn't just music, it was a power-given voice. The griots say that the entire palace shook when he played. People throughout Soso heard the sound and wondered what was happening. And Sumaoro, wherever he was, sensed that someone had violated his sanctuary. He returned to the palace in a rage. He burst into the chamber and found Balafaseke with his sacred balafon. The griot expected to be killed on the spot, and perhaps he should have been. But Sumaoro did something unexpected. Instead of executing Balafaseke, he was impressed. The griot had shown amazing courage, and his skill with the balafon was undeniable. More than that, Sumaoro's pride was engaged. Here was someone who could appreciate his power, who could understand and perhaps communicate the magnitude of what he had achieved. So Sumaoro spared him, but with a condition. Balafaseke would become his personal griot, singing praises of the sorcerer king's greatness. He would be kept close, under constant watch, basically a prisoner, but an honored one. For Balafaseke, this was both terrible and fortunate. Terrible, because he was now even more trapped, unable to escape or communicate with the outside world. But fortunate because it gave him even greater access to Sumaoro. And as he served the sorcerer king, singing his praises, playing his balafon, he listened and learned. He learned about Sumaoro's power, and importantly, about its limits. Because every magic system has rules. Every invincibility has conditions. And slowly, carefully, Balafaseke began to understand Sumaoro's vulnerability. The sorcerer king's power came from his mastery of spiritual forces, from the fetishes and rituals he had built up over decades. But that power had a specific weakness, a particular thing that could break it. And that weakness was related to his sacred totem. Every sorcerer had one, an animal or object that was symbolically connected to their power. If that connection could be cut or countered, the invincibility would fail. Balafaseke discovered that Somauro's totem was the rooster, specifically a white rooster. The sorcerer king's power could be broken by an arrow tipped with a white rooster's spur, the sharp, pointed growth on the back of a rooster's leg. It sounds almost silly, doesn't it? This great sorcerer king, this seemingly invincible tyrant, could be defeated by something as ordinary as a rooster spur. But that's the nature of magical thinking in many traditions. Great power often has specific, almost random weaknesses. The more powerful the magic, the more specific the vulnerability. Now Balafaseke had the information that could save his people, but he was trapped in Somauro's palace, unable to escape, unable to send word to Sundiata. All he could do was wait and hope that someday, somehow, he would have a chance to pass on what he had learned. That chance would come, but only after blood had been spilled and an army had been tested in battle. By the time Sundiata felt ready to return to Mandinka territory, he had put together a strong force. Not as large as Somauro's army, the sorcerer king still commanded more warriors, but significant enough to pose a real threat. More importantly, Sundiata's army was motivated in a way that Somauro's wasn't. His warriors were fighting for freedom, for their homelands, for a predicted king they believed in. Somauro's forces were fighting because they were ordered to, because they feared their master, because they were paid. History has shown repeatedly that motivated soldiers fight harder than forced recruits. Sundiata's strategy was carefully planned. He wouldn't attack Soso directly. That would be suicide. Instead, he would free Mandinka territory first, freeing his own people and establishing a base of power. Then, strengthened by Mandinka warriors who would surely join his cause once they saw he had returned, he could face Somauro in open battle. The army marched toward Niani, and word spread before them. The predicted prince was returning. The exile was coming home. The Lion King was reclaiming his throne. The Mandinka people, who had suffered under Somauro's tyranny for years, received the news with a mixture of hope and fear. Hope because finally someone was challenging the sorcerer king. Fear because they knew Somauro's power, and they worried that Sundiata's return would only bring more suffering if he failed. Somauro heard the news as well, and he was not afraid. Not yet. He had crushed many rebellions, defeated countless warriors. This exiled prince, no matter how predicted, was just another challenger to be eliminated. He sent a portion of his army to deal with Sundiata, not even bothering to go himself. The first battle took place on the plains outside a town called Negaboria. Sundiata's forces met Somauro's army in the kind of open combat that was traditional for the region. Warriors on both sides wore leather armor and carried spears, swords, and shields. Archers positioned themselves on the sides. War drums beat, setting the rhythm of combat. The griots say that before the battle, Sundiata addressed his warriors. His speech was simple but powerful. We fight not for conquest but for freedom. We fight not for glory but for our people. We fight not because we hate our enemies but because we love our homeland. And we fight knowing that fate is on our side. When the battle began, Sundiata proved that the years of exile had not been wasted. He had become an exceptional warrior and, more importantly, an exceptional leader. He fought in the front lines, not hiding behind his men, but leading them. His presence inspired courage in his warriors and created fear in his enemies. The battle was fierce, but Sundiata's forces had something Somauro lacked: unity of purpose. They fought as brothers, protecting each other, coordinating their attacks. Somauro's warriors, by contrast, fought as individuals, each concerned primarily with his own survival. By the end of the day, Sundiata had won his first battle. Somauro's forces retreated, leaving the field to the predicted king. It wasn't a decisive victory. The sorcerer king's main army was still intact, but it was psychologically important. It proved that Somauro could be beaten. It showed that the prediction might actually be true. News of the victory spread rapidly. Mandinka warriors who had been hiding, afraid to resist Somauro, began to emerge and join Sundiata's army. Villages that had been suppressed suddenly found their courage. Within weeks, most of Mandinka territory had been freed, but Sumaoro was now paying attention. This wasn't just another minor rebellion. This was a real threat, and he decided to deal with it personally. The sorcerer king gathered his full army, thousands of warriors, and marched toward Mandinka territory. He sent a message to Sundiata, mocking him, telling him to enjoy his small victory because it would be his last. Sumaoro promised to crush the rebellion, to kill Sundiata personally, and to enslave the entire Mandinka people as punishment for their defiance. Sundiata received this message calmly. He sent back his own response, and the griots have preserved his words. "I am the son of Sogolon. I am the fulfillment of prophecy. I am the Lion of Mali. Come if you dare, but know that your reign of terror ends here." It was a declaration of war, not just between two armies, but between two visions of power. Sumaoro represented control through fear and dark magic. Sundiata represented leadership through justice and fate. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of West Africa. But there was a problem. Sundiata still didn't know about Sumaoro's vulnerability. He didn't know about the White Rooster Spur. And without that knowledge, how could he hope to defeat an enemy who seemed invincible? The answer would come in the most unexpected way, through a daring escape and a loyal griot who had waited years for his moment. As Sumaoro prepared for his campaign against Sundiata, something unexpected happened in his palace. Balafaseke, who had been his captive griot for years, saw an opportunity for escape. The palace was in chaos with war preparations. Warriors were being assembled, supplies gathered, magical rituals performed. In all this confusion, security was less strict than usual, and Balafaseke, who had been carefully watching and planning for years, made his move. The details of his escape vary depending on which griot tells the story. Some say he simply walked out during the confusion, disguised as a common soldier. Others say he had help from palace servants who sympathized with the Mandinka cause. Still others claim he used trickery, telling guards that Sumaoro had sent him on a secret mission. However he did it, Balafaseke escaped from Soso and began the dangerous journey to find Sundiata. He traveled quickly, avoiding main roads, knowing that if he was caught he would be tortured and killed. But he also knew that the information he carried could change everything. When he finally reached Sundiata's camp, there was a joyous reunion. Sundiata had not seen his childhood friend and griot in over a decade. They had both been boys when they separated. Now they were men, tested by hardship and exile. The bond between them, instead of weakening over time and distance, had only grown stronger. But after the initial celebration, Balafaseke had urgent news to share. He told Sundiata everything he had learned about Sumaoro's power, the sacred chamber, the magical instruments, the source of his invincibility. And most importantly, he revealed the secret: Sumaoro's vulnerability to the White Rooster's spur. Sundiata listened carefully. To some of his warriors, this information seemed almost too simple. Could years of tyranny, an empire built on fear and dark magic, really be undone by something as ordinary as a rooster spur? But Sundiata understood. In spiritual warfare, specific knowledge was everything. Knowing your enemy's weakness was as important as having a strong army. He ordered his hunters to find a white rooster immediately. In some versions of the story, this was difficult. White roosters were rare and considered sacred, but eventually one was found. The hunters carefully removed one of its spurs, and the best arrow maker in Sundiata's army was called upon to make a special arrow tipped with the white rooster spur instead of a metal point. This arrow was prepared with ritual and ceremony. Prayers were said over it. Blessings were invoked because this wasn't just a weapon. It was the physical form of the counter-magic that could break Sumaoro's power. But possessing the arrow was one thing. Using it in battle was another. Sundiata would need to get close enough to Sumaoro to shoot it, which meant surviving combat with a sorcerer king whose magical protection had never failed. And even if he could get close enough, he would need to aim true, because he would likely only get one shot. The margin for error was razor thin. The two armies met at a place called Kirina in the year 1235. It was a vast plain, perfect for the kind of large-scale battle that was about to unfold. Sumaoro commanded the larger force. Estimates suggest he had perhaps 15,000 to 20,000 warriors. Sundiata's army was smaller, maybe 10,000 to 12,000, but every single one of them believed they were fighting for something greater than themselves. The night before the battle, Sundiata could not sleep. He walked through his camp, talking to his warriors, checking preparations, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. From the disabled child who couldn't walk to the exiled prince wandering homeless across West Africa to this, commanding an army about to face a sorcerer king in a battle that would determine the fate of nations. His sister, Sogolon Kolonkan, found him in the pre-dawn darkness. "Are you afraid?" she asked. Sundiata considered the question honestly. "Yes," he admitted. "But Mother taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It's acting despite fear. Tomorrow I will be afraid, and tomorrow I will fight anyway." As the sun rose over the plain of Kirina, both armies began their preparations. War drums thundered, warriors chanted, psyching themselves up for combat. Spiritual leaders on both sides performed rituals, calling on ancestors and spirits for protection and victory. Sumaoro appeared in the center of his army, and even from a distance, his presence was terrifying. He wore elaborate clothing covered in magical amulets and charms. His armor was said to be impenetrable, blessed by dark rituals. He carried weapons that had never failed to kill, and around him there was an aura of power that made even brave warriors hesitate. Sundiata, by contrast, wore simpler clothing. His power came not from elaborate magical preparations, but from the prediction, from the rightness of his cause, from the loyalty of his warriors. Where Sumaoro inspired fear, Sundiata inspired hope. The battle began with the traditional exchange of arrows. Archers on both sides released volley after volley, darkening the sky with their projectiles. Warriors fell on both sides, the first casualties of what would become a legendary confrontation. Then came the main engagement. The armies crashed together like two waves colliding. The sound was overwhelming. The clash of weapons, the cries of wounded men, the war drums, the shouted commands of leaders trying to coordinate their forces in the chaos of combat. Sundiata fought in the thick of it. His personal guards struggled to keep up with him. He was everywhere at once, it seemed, rallying his warriors, leading charges, turning the tide wherever his forces were weakening. The griots say he fought like a lion, the animal of his name and fate, fearless, powerful, magnificent. But despite his leadership, despite the courage of his warriors, the battle was not going well. Sumaoro's sorcery was having its effect. Sundiata's warriors found themselves mysteriously weakening when they engaged Sumaoro's elite guards. Arrows that should have struck home veered away. Spears thrown with perfect accuracy somehow missed their targets, and then Sumaoro himself entered the combat directly, cutting through Sundiata's warriors like they were children. He seemed untouchable, invincible, just as the legend said. Warriors who attacked him found their weapons useless. It was as if he was protected by an invisible shield. Sundiata watched this and knew that conventional combat wouldn't work. He had to confront Sumaoro directly. He had to use the special arrow. He called for his bow, and for the arrow tipped with the white rooster's spur. His warriors created a wedge formation, protecting him, pushing toward where Sumaoro was devastating their ranks. It was a desperate maneuver, and many warriors died creating the path. But they did it willingly, because they understood what was at stake. Finally, Sundiata was close enough. He could see Sumaoro clearly now, could see the sorcerer king's eyes gleaming with confident hatred. Sumaoro saw him too and laughed, a sound that echoed across the battlefield. "So the disabled child has come to face me," Sumaoro shouted. "Do you really think you can defeat me? I am invincible. I'm eternal. Your prediction is a lie." Sundiata said nothing. He fitted the special arrow, drew his bow, and aimed. Everything slowed down at that moment. The noise of battle faded. His entire life, the years of humiliation, the exile, his mother's sacrifice, the prediction, all of it concentrated into this single moment, this single shot. He released the arrow. The arrow flew true, and something remarkable happened. Sumaoro tried to dodge, tried to use his magical protection, but it failed. The arrow pierced that invisible shield as if it didn't exist. It struck Sumaoro in the shoulder. Not a killing blow, but enough to draw blood. And with that blood, everything changed. Sumaoro screamed not in pain, but in shock and terror. His invincibility was broken. For the first time in years, he felt vulnerable. The magical protection that had made him seem like a god was gone, shattered by the white rooster's spur. His warriors saw their invincible leader wounded and bleeding. Panic spread through Sumaoro's army like wildfire. If the sorcerer king could bleed, he could die. If he could die, there was no reason to keep fighting for him. Sumaoro, realizing that his power was broken and his army was collapsing, did something that shocked everyone. He ran away. The great sorcerer king, who had conquered kingdoms and terrorized entire regions, ran from the battlefield. His army, seeing their leader flee, broke completely. What had been an organized force moments ago became a mob of men desperate to escape. They threw down their weapons and ran. Many of them surrendered to Sundiata's warriors. Others simply fled into the countryside. Sundiata's forces, seeing their enemies collapse, erupted in victory cries. The impossible had happened. The prediction was being fulfilled. The Lion King had defeated the Sorcerer King. But Sundiata didn't celebrate yet. He organized a pursuit of Sumaoro, determined to either capture or kill him to ensure he could never threaten the land again. The chase led into the mountains, through difficult terrain where Sumaoro was hoping to find refuge. But his own people, whom he had ruled through fear for so long, refused to help him. Village after village closed their gates when they saw him approaching. No one wanted to be associated with a fallen tyrant. The griots tell different versions of what happened to Sumaoro in the end. Some say he was caught and killed by Sundiata's warriors. Others say he disappeared into a cave and was never seen again, perhaps dying of his wounds in solitude. Still others claim he transformed himself into stone, becoming a mountain that still exists today as a warning about the dangers of tyrannical power. What matters is that Sumaoro is gone. His reign of terror was over, and Sundiata stood victorious. The prediction proved true beyond any doubt. The Battle of Kirina was over. But the work of building an empire was just beginning. In the aftermath of Kirina, Sundiata faced a choice that would define his legacy. He had defeated Sumaoro, freed his people, and fulfilled the basic prediction. He could have simply reclaimed Niani, re-established the small Mandinka kingdom his father had ruled, and lived out his life as a local king. Still a great achievement after years of exile. But Sundiata saw a bigger opportunity, a chance to create something unprecedented in West African history. The region was in chaos. Sumaoro's empire had collapsed, leaving dozens of conquered territories without clear leadership. Many of these kingdoms had been allies of Sumaoro, either willingly or through force. Others had been neutral, watching from the sidelines. Now they all face an uncertain future. Sundiata could have conquered them all, imposing his rule through military force the way Sumaoro had. He had the army to do it. His victory at Kirina had made him the most powerful military leader in the region. But that's not what he did. Instead, he called a great assembly at a place called Kurukan Fuga. He invited leaders from all the kingdoms of the savannah, not just those who had supported him, but also those who had remained neutral or even fought against him. It was a radical act of inclusion, and it set the tone for everything that followed. The assembly lasted for days. Representatives from dozens of kingdoms gathered to discuss the future. And what came out of these discussions was remarkable. Not an empire built on conquest, but a confederation built on cooperation. Sundiata proposed a new political structure. Each kingdom would keep its independence, its own rulers, its own customs and traditions. But they would all be part of a larger whole, the Mali Empire, bound together by mutual defense agreements, trade relationships, and shared governance structures. There would be a central authority, which Sundiata would lead as Mansa or emperor. But this authority would be limited. Local matters would remain local. The empire would handle only what was truly imperial: defense, major trade routes, dispute resolution between kingdoms, and the maintenance of peace. It was a form of federalism created in 13th century West Africa, centuries before similar ideas would emerge in Europe. But Sundiata didn't stop with political structure. He also established what historians call the Kurukan Fuga Constitution, a set of laws and principles that would govern the empire. The griots have preserved these laws through oral tradition, and they're remarkable for their time. The constitution established rules about governance, declaring that leaders should rule with justice and wisdom, not tyranny. It established property rights, determining how land could be owned and transferred. It created a system of social organization, defining different professional groups: farmers, blacksmiths, griots, traders, and their roles in society. But perhaps most remarkably, it included humanitarian principles. There were rules against making fun of people with disabilities, undoubtedly influenced by Sundiata's own experience. There were provisions for the treatment of women, establishing their rights within the social system. There were even environmental protections, rules about how forests should be preserved and how certain resources should be managed sustainably. It wasn't perfect by modern standards. It still included slavery, for instance, and women's rights were limited compared to what we'd expect today. But for its time and place, it was extraordinarily progressive. The kingdoms agreed to this arrangement. One by one, their leaders pledged allegiance to Sundiata and to the new Mali Empire. Some did so enthusiastically, seeing the benefits of stability and collective security. Others did so more reluctantly. But even they recognized that this was a better option than the chaos of competing warlords or the tyranny of another Sumaoro. And so the Mali Empire was born, not through conquest alone, but through consent and cooperation. It was the fulfillment of the prediction, but in a way that transcended simple kingship. Sundiata had become not just a king, but the founder of a new civilization. He established his capital at Niani, rebuilding and expanding the city of his birth. He organized the empire's administration, appointing governors and creating systems for communication and coordination across vast distances. He promoted trade, recognizing that prosperity came from exchange and cooperation rather than hoarding and isolation. The trans-Saharan trade routes, which had always been important, now flourished under Mali's protection. Merchants could travel safely across the empire, knowing they would be protected from bandits and warlords. Gold from the south moved north toward the Mediterranean. Salt from the Sahara moved south. Ideas, technologies, and cultures mixed and flowed. Within years, Mali was becoming wealthy. Not through exploitation, though there was that too, but primarily through trade and productivity. The stability Sundiata had created allowed agriculture to flourish. Farmers could plant crops without worrying about armies destroying their fields. Craftspeople could develop their skills without fear of random confiscation. Traders could invest in long-distance commerce, knowing that contracts would be honored, and Sundiata himself proved to be everything the prediction had promised. He ruled with wisdom and justice. He remained accessible to his people, hearing disputes and complaints personally. He didn't become cruel or tyrannical in victory. His mother's final advice had taken root. He remembered where he came from, remembered the suffering of exile, and he ruled in a way that tried to minimize suffering for others. He also showed remarkable tolerance for the era. Mali was home to diverse peoples with different religions and customs. There were traditional African religious practitioners, like Sundiata himself. There were Muslims, whose religion had been spreading across West Africa through trade networks. There were people with hybrid beliefs, mixing elements of different traditions. Sundiata didn't try to impose religious uniformity. Instead, he allowed people to practice their beliefs freely as long as they kept peace and followed the empire's laws. This tolerance would become one of Mali's defining characteristics and one of the sources of its strength. When people feel free to be themselves, when diversity is celebrated rather than suppressed, societies flourish. Sundiata understood this naturally, but building an empire isn't just about grand political structures and laws. It's also about the small human details, and Sundiata never forgot those. He honored the debts from his exile years. Every person who had helped his family when they were wandering and powerless was rewarded, not with empty titles, but with real positions of responsibility and shares of the empire's growing wealth. He remembered the king of Mima, who had given him shelter and sent gifts and representatives, maintaining that friendship even though he no longer needed it. He elevated those who had been loyal when loyalty was dangerous. The warriors who had joined him before Kirina, when victory was uncertain, received higher honors than those who joined after, when success seemed assured. He understood that timing mattered, that those who believe in you when you have nothing are more valuable than those who serve you when you have everything. He also made sure his family was provided for. His siblings, who had shared his exile and suffering, were given positions of honor. His mother's memory was celebrated with monuments and rituals. Her grave became a place of pilgrimage, where people would go to pay respects to the woman whose faith and sacrifice had made the empire possible. And he didn't forget his enemies, at least not the ones who could be redeemed. Many of Sumauro's former warriors were integrated into Mali's army. Kingdoms that had opposed him were not destroyed, but given a chance to join the Confederation on equal terms. Sundiata understood that the strongest empires are built not just by defeating enemies, but by converting them into allies. There were, of course, those who refused to accept the new order. Some warlords tried to resist, attempting to carve out their own territories. Some kingdoms tried to remain independent, thinking they could survive outside the Mali system. Sundiata dealt with these challenges firmly, but without unnecessary cruelty. He used military force when necessary, but he always offered diplomacy first. And when he did conquer, he didn't destroy. He incorporated, he integrated, he transformed. The Mali Empire grew rapidly in the years following Kirina. Within a decade, it controlled territory from the Atlantic coast in the west to the desert in the north, from the forests in the south to the Niger River bend in the east. It wasn't the largest empire in the world, far from it, but it was substantial, powerful, and most importantly, stable. That stability attracted even more people and wealth. Merchants from North Africa and the Middle East established trading posts in Mali's cities. Scholars came to study and teach. Craftspeople came to practice their trades in a secure environment. The empire became a magnet for talent and ambition, and always at the center of it all was Sundiata, the former disabled child, the exiled prince, now the Mansa of Mali, the Lion King. He ruled from Niani, but he traveled extensively through his empire, showing himself to his people, resolving disputes, ensuring that his governors were ruling justly. He also became a patron of the arts, particularly of the griots who had preserved his story and the stories of his ancestors. He understood that cultural memory was as important as military power or economic wealth. An empire that forgets its history is an empire that will eventually lose its identity. So he supported the griots, ensuring they were honored and protected, guaranteeing that the stories would continue to be passed down. The years passed. Sundiata aged from a young man into middle age, then into his elder years. He never lost his physical strength. The griots say he remained powerful until the end of his life. But he became wiser, more thoughtful. He had achieved everything the prediction promised and more. He had transformed a broken region into a unified empire. He had brought peace after decades of conflict. He had created wealth and stability for millions of people. But empires, like people, are mortal. And Sundiata knew that his greatest challenge wasn't building the empire. It was making sure it would survive after he was gone. As Sundiata grew older, he turned his attention to succession. He had learned from his father's mistake. King Magan had chosen tradition over the prediction, and it had led to chaos, exile, and eventually the Sumaoro crisis. Sundiata was determined not to repeat that error. He had sons, and he needed to choose which one would succeed him. But he didn't just want to name an heir. He wanted to prepare the empire for a smooth transition because he understood something important. The greatest leaders are not those who cannot be replaced, but those who make sure their work continues after they're gone. He began systematically training his chosen successor, teaching him not just the mechanics of rule, but the philosophy behind it. He made sure his son understood the principles that had made Mali successful: tolerance, justice, cooperation rather than control. He introduced him to the empire's various leaders, making sure relationships were established before the succession. He also institutionalized the empire's governance structures. He made sure the Confederation of Kingdoms was not dependent on his personal relationships, but was built on systems and agreements that would outlast any individual ruler. He strengthened the role of councils and advisors, creating checks on imperial power that would prevent future rulers from becoming tyrants. The exact date and circumstances of Sundiata's death are uncertain, preserved more in legend than in precise historical record. The griots offer different accounts. Some say he died peacefully in old age, surrounded by his family, having lived to see his grandchildren. Others say he died in an accident during a celebration. Some versions say he drowned in the Niger River. Others say he was killed by an arrow meant for someone else. What all the traditions agree on is that his death was a moment of profound mourning across the empire. For weeks, people from every corner of Mali made pilgrimages to Niani to pay their respects. The griots sang songs of his life, making sure every detail would be remembered. Warriors who had fought with him at Kirina, now old men themselves, came to honor their king one last time. But alongside the mourning was pride, because Sundiata had done what he set out to do. The empire he created was strong enough to survive his death. The transition to his successor was smooth, without the civil war that so often came with succession in that era. And the Mali Empire that he founded didn't just survive, it thrived. Under his successors, particularly his grandnephew, Mansa Musa, a century later, Mali would become one of the wealthiest and most famous empires in the world. Mansa Musa's pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324 would become legendary. He brought so much gold with him that he temporarily destabilized the Mediterranean economy. His group included thousands of people, and his generosity was so extravagant that stories of the wealthy king of Mali spread across 3 continents. The universities of Timbuktu, particularly Sankore, would become centers of learning that rivaled any in the world. Scholars from across Africa, the Middle East, and even Europe would come to study mathematics, astronomy, medicine, law, and theology. The libraries of Timbuktu would house hundreds of thousands of manuscripts, preserving knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. Mali would control the trans-Saharan trade routes for centuries, becoming the primary source of gold for the Mediterranean world and beyond. At its height, the empire would control territory comparable in size to Western Europe, with a population in the millions. And all of it, the wealth, the learning, the stability, the influence, all of it traced back to Sundiata, to the disabled child who learned to walk, to the exiled prince who learned patience, to the warrior king who learned that true power comes not from control, but from justice. The griots have preserved his story for over 8 centuries now. In villages across West Africa, his epic is still sung, still recited, still used to teach lessons about courage, perseverance, and leadership. Children grow up hearing about the Lion King of Mali, about how the weakest can become the strongest, about how fate rewards those who never give up. But Sundiata's legacy extends beyond oral tradition and historical influence. It touches something deeper in human experience. His story resonates because it speaks to universal themes that transcend culture and time. It's a story about disability and triumph, about being told you're not good enough and proving everyone wrong, about suffering that refines character rather than breaking it. It's a story about exile and return, about losing everything and rebuilding from nothing, about how the journey away from home can be what prepares you to truly lead when you return. It's a story about prediction and free will, about fate that must be earned, not simply received, about how knowing your purpose is different from achieving it. The path still requires courage, sacrifice, and choice. It's a story about power and its proper use, about how leadership is service, not control, about how the strongest empires are built on cooperation rather than conquest. And perhaps most powerfully, it's a story about a mother's love and a son's determination to honor that love by becoming worthy of it. The Mali Empire that Sundiata founded would last for over 4 centuries. Think about that for a moment. 400 years of continuous existence, from the 13th century until the 17th century, when it finally broke apart under pressure from new empires and changing trade patterns. For comparison, that's longer than the United States has existed as a nation. It's longer than the British Empire dominated global trade. It's a span of time that covers the entire European Renaissance, the age of exploration, the Protestant Reformation. While Europe was going through its medieval period and emerging into modernity, Mali was already an established, sophisticated empire with institutions, laws, and cultural achievements that rivaled anything in the world. But empires, like all human institutions, eventually declined. By the 16th and 17th centuries, Mali's power was fading. New trade routes had emerged that bypassed its territory. New empires like Songhai rose to challenge its dominance. Internal divisions weakened central authority. The factors that led to its decline were complex and numerous, as they always are with great civilizations. Yet even as the political entity of Mali faded, Sundiata's legacy persisted in other forms. The Mandinka people, whom Sundiata had unified and led, spread across West Africa. Today, there are millions of Mandinka descendants living in countries from Senegal to Burkina Faso, from Guinea to Gambia. They still identify with their heritage, still tell stories of the Lion King, still maintain cultural practices that trace back to the Mali Empire. The griots, those oral historians who preserve Sundiata's story, continue their tradition to this day. In 21st century West Africa, griots still perform the epic of Sundiata at ceremonies and celebrations. They still memorize the genealogies, the histories, the lessons. They've adapted to modern times. Some now use electronic instruments alongside traditional ones. Some record their performances for radio or internet distribution. But the core tradition remains unbroken across 8 centuries. Scholars and historians have worked to piece together Mali's history from multiple sources. There are the oral traditions, of course, but also written records from Arab travelers and historians who visited Mali at its height. Ibn Battuta, the famous Moroccan explorer, visited Mali in the 1350s and left detailed accounts of its society, economy, and culture. His descriptions of Mali's justice system, its security, and its wealth provide historical confirmation for the traditions about Sundiata's founding principles. Archaeological work in places like Niani and other Mali Empire sites has uncovered physical evidence of the civilization's sophistication. The remains of buildings, artifacts, trade goods from distant lands. This physical evidence confirms what the traditions say. Mali was not a primitive or backward place. It was a complex, developed civilization with advanced governance, economics, and culture. In the modern era, Sundiata has become a symbol for African pride and identity. During the 20th century, as African nations fought for and achieved independence from European colonialism, Sundiata's story took on new significance. He represented Africa's historical greatness, proof that the continent had produced sophisticated civilizations long before European contact. Leaders of independence movements and post-colonial nations explicitly invoked Sundiata. Kwame Nkrumah in Ghana, Sekou Touré in Guinea, and others used his story to inspire their people and to counter racist narratives that claimed Africans had no history of advanced civilization. Sundiata became not just a historical figure but a political symbol of African capability and achievement. The Epic of Sundiata has been translated into numerous languages and studied in universities around the world. It's taught in literature courses alongside other great epics like Homer's Odyssey or the Mesopotamian Epic of Gilgamesh. Scholars have analyzed its narrative structure, its themes, and its cultural significance. It's recognized as one of humanity's great stories, belonging not just to West Africa, but to the world. Artists have been inspired by Sundiata's story. There have been novels based on his life, plays performed on stages from Bamako to New York, paintings and sculptures depicting his key moments. Musicians have composed works based on the epic, some traditional and others contemporary, mixing ancient themes with modern sounds. And then there's a connection that might surprise you. Disney's The Lion King. In the 1990s, when Disney was developing The Lion King, some of the writers and researchers drew inspiration from the epic of Sundiata. The parallels are striking. A young prince whose father dies, leaving him vulnerable. An evil uncle figure who takes power. The young prince goes into exile, seemingly leaving his kingdom to darkness. But then he returns as a grown and powerful leader to reclaim his throne and restore justice to the land. Disney has never officially confirmed that Sundiata was a direct source. They also drew on Hamlet and other stories, but the similarities are too substantial to be coincidental. Whether intentional or not, echoes of the 13th century West African epic found their way into one of the most successful animated films ever made. Seen by hundreds of millions of people worldwide. Think about that. An 8th-century-old African story, preserved by oral tradition, influenced a modern global phenomenon. Sundiata's roar literally reached across centuries and continents, touching cultures and people who have never heard his name, but have absorbed elements of his story. But beyond all the historical, cultural, and political significance, what makes Sundiata's story endure is something simpler and more profound. It's a story about human potential. It says that where you start doesn't determine where you finish. That disabilities and setbacks are not destinies. That exile and suffering can be teachers rather than destroyers. That leadership is about character more than birthright. That justice and cooperation create stronger foundations than fear and control. These aren't just historical lessons or cultural teachings. They're human truths that resonate across time and place, because they speak to fundamental experiences and hopes that all people share. Every person who has ever felt weak and wanted to be strong can find inspiration in the child who couldn't walk but became a king. Every person who has ever felt displaced or exiled can find hope in the wanderer who found his way home. Every person who has ever faced an impossibly powerful enemy can find courage in the warrior who defeated the invincible sorcerer king. Sundiata's story survives not because historians preserved it, though they have. Not because it's politically useful, though it is. Not because it's culturally important, though it certainly is. It survives because it speaks to something essential in the human spirit. The belief that we can overcome, that we can rise, that we can become more than we are. As we reach the end of this journey through Sundiata's life and legacy, it's worth thinking about what makes a person truly great. Not just successful, not just powerful, but great in a way that echoes through centuries. Sundiata could have become bitter. He had every reason to. Made fun of as a child for his disability, rejected by his father in favor of his brother, driven into exile by a family that wanted him dead, forced to wander for years, watching his mother's health decline, watching his siblings suffer. He could have let that experience fill him with rage and resentment. He could have returned to Niani seeking revenge rather than liberation. He could have become a tyrant, using his power to punish everyone who had ever doubted or hurt him. But he didn't. Instead, he became a leader who ruled with justice and wisdom. He built an empire based on cooperation rather than control. He honored those who had helped him and gave chances to those who had opposed him. He created systems designed to prevent future tyranny, rather than consolidating all power in himself. This transformation from victim to victor, from exile to emperor, from suffering to strength, without becoming cruel or corrupt in the process, is perhaps his greatest achievement. Greater than winning the Battle of Kirina. Greater than founding an empire, because it represents a triumph not over external enemies, but over internal ones, over bitterness, over ego, over the temptation to use power for revenge rather than justice. Sundiata's story also reminds us about the role of support systems in greatness. He didn't succeed alone. His mother's unwavering faith sustained him through his darkest years. His friend Bala Faseke risked his life to provide crucial information. King Tonkara gave him shelter and opportunity when others turned him away. Warriors and allies believed in the prediction even when it seemed impossible. No one achieves greatness in isolation. Behind every remarkable individual are people who believed in them, supported them, taught them, challenged them, and loved them. Zogolon's faith in her son was as essential to his success as his own courage. The prediction gave him a sense of fate, but it was the people around him who made that fate achievable. The story also speaks to the power of time and patience. Sundiata didn't fulfill his prediction immediately. He didn't walk at 1 year old and became king at 2. He spent 7 years unable to walk. He spent perhaps a decade in exile. He had to wait, to endure, to prepare. The prediction was always there, but it unfolded according to its own timeline, not his preferred schedule. In our modern world of instant gratification, where we expect immediate results and rapid success, Sundiata's story is a reminder that greatness often requires patience. That the time spent in preparation is not wasted time. That exile and wandering can be essential education. That waiting doesn't mean failing. Sometimes it means ripening, maturing, becoming ready for what fate has in store. His story also illustrates the importance of memory and storytelling. If the griots had not preserved his story, if the oral tradition had been broken, Sundiata would have faded into obscurity. The Mali Empire would be a footnote in history books, known only to specialists. But because griots faithfully passed down his story generation after generation, refusing to let it die, even when the empire itself declined, Sundiata lives on. This is why oral tradition matters, why stories matter, why the arts and humanities matter. They preserve human experience across time. They connect us to our ancestors and to each other. They teach lessons that raw data and statistics cannot convey. They remind us of our capacity for both greatness and failure, for nobility and cruelty, for courage and cowardice. In West Africa, the griots say every old person who dies is a library burning. Each generation that passes takes with it unique experiences, wisdom, and stories. If those stories are not passed down, they vanish forever. The fact that Sundiata's story has survived 8 centuries of oral transmission before being written down in the modern era is a testament to the power and reliability of oral tradition when it's taken seriously and practiced with discipline. As we think about Sundiata today, in our 21st century context, what lessons can we draw? What does an 8-century-old story about a West African king have to teach us? Perhaps the most important lesson is about the nature of strength. Sundiata teaches us that strength is not just physical power or military might. It's a character. It's resilience. It's the ability to endure suffering without becoming cruel. It's the wisdom to build coalitions rather than conquering enemies. It's the humility to remember where you came from, even after you've achieved everything. He also teaches us about leadership. True leadership is not about dominating others, but about empowering them. It's not about taking credit, but about sharing success. It's not about concentrating power, but about creating systems that will outlast you. Sundiata could have made himself an absolute monarch, but instead he created a confederation that balanced central authority with local independence. He could have punished all his enemies, but instead he converted many of them into allies. He thought not just about his own reign, but about the long-term health of his empire. In an era where leadership is often equated with showmanship, with charisma and self-promotion, Sundiata reminds us that the best leaders are those who build institutions, not cults of personality, who create systems, not dependencies, who think in generations, not just election cycles or quarterly reports. His story also speaks to the modern challenges of nation-building and conflict resolution. Mali succeeded because Sundiata created a system where diverse groups could maintain their identities while being part of a larger whole. He didn't try to impose uniformity or eliminate differences. He created structures where diversity was a strength rather than a weakness. In our modern world, torn by ethnic conflicts, religious divisions, and political polarization, this is a lesson worth remembering. Unity doesn't require uniformity. Strength doesn't require everyone to be the same. Sometimes the most stable and prosperous societies are those that embrace difference and create systems where diverse groups can cooperate while maintaining their distinct identities. Finally, Sundiata's story reminds us that history is bigger than Europe and the West. For too long, world history has been taught as if it were primarily European history, with brief interludes about other regions. But while Europe was in its medieval period, Mali was building an empire with sophisticated governance, thriving trade networks, and cultural achievements that rivaled anything in the world. Africa has a history of complex civilizations, powerful empires, and remarkable individuals, not just during ancient Egypt, but throughout the continent and throughout time. Sundiata is one of many great African leaders and empire builders whose stories deserve to be known as widely as those of European kings and conquerors. His story is part of humanity's shared heritage, a reminder that greatness and achievement have emerged from every corner of the world, from every culture and people. The more we learn these stories, the more we appreciate the full richness and complexity of human history. And so we return to where we began. A prediction spoken over 8 centuries ago. A disabled child who seemed to disprove that prediction. A mother who never lost faith. An exile that built character. A return that fulfilled fate. A battle that changed history. An empire that lasted centuries. This is the story of Sundiata, the Lion King of Mali. But it's also more than that. It's a story about human potential and perseverance. It's a story about how suffering can refine us rather than break us if we choose to let it. It's a story about the power of faith, not necessarily religious faith, but faith in possibilities, in predictions, in people. It's a story that has survived 8 centuries because it speaks to something universal in human experience. Because everyone has felt weak at some point. Everyone has faced challenges that seemed impossible. Everyone has wondered if they had the strength to overcome, to rise, to become what they were meant to be, and Sundiata's story answers, yes, you do. Not easily, not quickly, not without sacrifice and suffering, but yes, you do. The disabled child walked. The exiled prince returned. The predicted king ruled. And his roar, the roar of the Lion of Mali, still echoes across centuries, across continents, across cultures. Still inspiring, still teaching, still reminding us that fate belongs to those who refuse to give up. 800 years ago, a mother held her struggling son and told him he would be great. She believed it when no one else did. She held on to that faith through mockery, exile, and suffering. And she lived just long enough to see the first signs that she had been right all along. Today, millions of people know her son's name. His empire is studied in universities. His story is told in countless languages. His legacy lives on in the descendants of the Mali Empire and in everyone who finds inspiration in his journey from weakness to strength. That is the power of prediction fulfilled. That is the triumph of faith rewarded. That is the legacy of Sundiata, the Lion King of Mali. If this story moved you, if you're amazed that you'd never heard of this incredible man before, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Leave a comment telling me what part of Sundiata's story impacted you most. and subscribe to this channel so you never miss another forgotten story of human greatness brought back to life. Share this video with someone who needs to hear a story about overcoming impossible odds. Share it with history lovers. Share it with anyone who thinks they know world history but has never heard of the Mali Empire. Because stories like Sundiata's deserve to be known. They need to be told, shared, remembered. They're part of our human heritage. All of us, regardless of where we come from. The Lion of Mali roared 8 centuries ago, but his roar hasn't faded. It's still here, still powerful, still inspiring, and now you're part of keeping that roar alive by sharing his story. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of history's most remarkable lives. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and never forget, greatness can come from the most unexpected places.